That's great, thank you. Right, well, welcome everybody to this session on enterprise and economic recovery. It's nice to see so many people here. As you know, myself and Ian co-chair the forum, and we take it in turns to either chair or chip in. So it's my turn this time to chair. So enterprise, setting up and running a business, it is a fundamental element of economic recovery. And whether those businesses go on to grow and perhaps grow really significantly, or all they ever do, if you can call it that, is to provide somebody with a living, they're all really, really important to that. And yeah, a vibrant community, I think, of small businesses is a key element of having a sustainable and resilient economy with opportunities for all. And I really do mean all, because like a lot of you, I've been in enterprise support for a long time. And, you know, over those years, I've seen people with really acute disabilities, people with significant learning difficulties, ex-offenders, old people, younger people, people with sort of quite onerous caring responsibilities, refugees and others who can barely, if at all, speak English, you know, people with a real passion for what they want to do, people who just don't see any other options, that whole gamut of people, and all of them have actually, you know, started in business and made real successes of those business. So I think it's a really key part of what we all do. And obviously, you know, that range of people also find opportunities within small businesses run by other people. And that's not to say it's not challenging, and it's perhaps never been more challenging than it is in a crisis like this one. But also in a crisis, the demand for that is particularly strong. So before I hand over to Julia, have you got anything that you would like to add to that, Ian?
No, I think that was a pretty clear intro. I think the only thing that I'd add at this point, it's a pretty poignant time as well. We're all obviously adapting to the different rules and regulations and laws, etc. We normally see as a recovery starts to turn around a spike in self-employment. We're expecting it to be slightly different this time around. And with the advent of a number of the programs coming through, the likes of the people on this call and the wider people working in welfare to work need to recognise that there'll be a number of people who come to this program with, as Suzanne has mentioned, quite often no other option, or it is the best option, or they're in a position either with capital in hand from redundancy, or the schemes that are coming through either locally or nationally, that they'll be challenging self-employment as an option. So just slight add, Suzanne. But.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really useful, Ian. Thank you. So with that in mind, we'll hand over to Professor Julia Rouse, who is going to talk to us about the importance of people management skills and how we raise those management skills in small businesses, and also about the Good Employment Learning Lab. So over to you, Julia.
Thanks very much. And in fact, I wonder if you mind if I start off on self-employment and then move on to small firms. Is that okay?
Whatever you would like to do, you are more than welcome to.
Okay, so yeah, this crisis is interesting in relation to self-employment, isn't it? Because I've spent much of the last year lobbying, initially doing research and then lobbying around gaps in the self-employment income support scheme. And I think so I've got a couple of things to say about it, really. One is that we've had this kind of sustaining of self-employment going on for those who've been eligible for the self-employment income support scheme, and they're about to probably fall off a cliff edge. And the question is, what support do they need to either sustain their self-employment or indeed to, can you not see me? Somebody said put the camera on.
No, we can't see you.
We can't see you.
Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off again because I can see myself and try on again. See if that works. Any good?
We can see you now.
Strange thing, Teams, sometimes, isn't it? Okay, so I'm worried about the cliff edge of coming off of the self-employment income support scheme and what support a lot of people in self-employment may need to either create a new strategy within that self-employment in the context of questionable markets for their work in some instances, or what support they might need to exit out of self-employment in a way that's safe. My position on all of this is that we want to create decent self-employment. And I'm concerned that schemes in the past sometimes have promoted self-employment to anyone, and that we've been incentivized to start up, but not necessarily to stay with businesses over time. We get a very strong positive feeling that we're helping people kind of write themselves into a new narrative of opportunity as they're starting up and writing a business plan or whatever. But whether or not they're actually making a living is a completely different question. And the evidence tells us that there has been, as there's been a massive rise in self-employment before the crisis, there was a massive decline in income from self-employment and many self-employed families falling into poverty. So I was concerned prior to COVID about poverty and self-employment, and I'm even more concerned about it now. And then there are the people who have fallen through the cracks. We reckon there's about 1.3 million who fell through the cracks of the self-employment income support scheme. The newly self-employed, thankfully, were included in the budget statement, but that'll only include people who started up and started making profit before April 2020. So it won't help people who've started during the pandemic period. So we've got a variable policy context out there that will have created very, very different conditions for different types of self-employed. But if we broaden that and we start thinking about business directors, because as you know, you face the choice of whether or not you establish yourself as self-employed or as a director of a micro business. And micro business owners who may be doing, freelancers who may be doing exactly the same work as a self-employed person in reality, have not been eligible for any income support except if they furlough themselves. So again, I think we've managed as a nation to create the concept that small businesses have had sufficient support. But out there in micro enterprise, and particularly in the areas and the sectors that have been most affected, I don't believe that to be true. On the other hand, the government's got a very difficult productivity challenge, because is it sensible to keep sustaining self-employment on micro enterprise, which doesn't create good work and doesn't help people to make a living, whether in the crisis or outside the crisis? So I really think that we need to commission policy that takes a longer term view of enabling people to accrue the resources they need to have a fighting chance of succeeding in self-employment, or that creates a transition out of self-employment for people who give it a shot and can't make a living at it. There may be some exceptions, groups, as you say, who in a sense have no other option or who are creating other forms of social value through their self-employment. We don't really have the policy context to sustain them at the moment. Because of the minimum income floor under universal credit, there's a kind of natural trying to eke people out of unproductive self-employment. So I think that we have these kind of, if you like, nudges, these financial nudges, but we don't necessarily have a support process that's directly aligned to those nudges. And I think people can often find themselves alone at the time when their businesses are failing. That concerns me greatly, because I do the sort of research where I sit in high-rise council flats with people spending their child benefit on a business that's got no prospects. So I think that there are some big ethical issues here and some really tricky business support and policy issues here around self-employment. We have, I don't know if people realise, but almost all the jobs growth created out of the last recession came from self-employment. Now, whether or not we will see that out of this crisis is another issue, because will there be the market for that level of self-employment? Almost concerningly, I am beginning to see in Manchester small firms who understandably don't want to take on staff because of the uncertainty of lockdown rules, etc. And so they are really staffing themselves through very precarious gig economy type self-employment. So we may see some sort of recovery growth in that kind of work, just very precarious work. Some of that may lead to more sustainable self-employment, but I think some of it won't. Some of it will be barely legal employment practice. So we're going to see a range of things going on out there, and it's really interesting, I know, for people on the ground to work out how to orientate sort of scarce resources to thinking around all of that. Now, the government, of course, does fund a range of forms of business support, and I think the crisis has shown for me two things. One is the fetish with growth has tended to neglect the sheer scale of jobs created in micro businesses. Businesses may not grow, but large numbers of people are employed in them. They may not be the sexy growth productive sectors, but large numbers of people are employed in them. And that employment really matters to the country. So that's one thing. I think we need an industrial policy that recognises work as an important part of our economy. But the other thing is that I think that small business support very rarely supports people management. And this goes to what are the skills of our small business support providers, because not many of them come from a kind of HR background. Now, I'm not proposing that we import HR practice out of large firms into small firms in an unthinking fashion. But nevertheless, I would pose the question of how well do we think that our small business advisors are equipped to offer decent people management advice to our small firms. And they've got massive people management dilemmas at the moment, haven't they? Around well-being, working from home, working out who's going to come back when, how do you manage return from furlough? There are just enormous people management challenges out there. And what support is available to try and help firms to shape good work? Now, on this sort of on this issue of how do we get small firms to shape good work, I have a project that's funded by the UK Research and Innovation funding body called the Good Employment Learning Lab, and I'll post some links in the chat box when I've finished. And in the Good Employment Learning Lab, we're working with two sets of partners. In Greater Manchester, sort of exploring the idea of a place-based approach to developing good work. We're working with the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, which is one of Andy Burnham's leading sort of beacon policy ideas. And the Good Employment Charter has brought together, I think, a really genuinely impressive body of stakeholders from unions through to business, including CIPD and ACAS and all the kind of bodies that you would expect to be around issues of people management, to develop some principles of good work and to move organisations through a process of learning to become better employers. And when I've talked to people in the Good Employment Charter about, you know, practically, how do we do this? How do we work? And particularly, how do we work with small firms? We get into the we get into the sort of interesting issue of, you know, how do you cheaply and efficiently work out what works to develop people management practice? So the Good Employment Learning Lab, we are taking 3 people management challenges, starting with secure and agile work, so very much speaking into pandemic issues. And we're trialling masterclasses, coaching and peer learning, and sort of journeys between those forms of learning, and doing a realist evaluation to really work out what works for whom, when, where and why to develop people management practice in small firms, but also in large firms in public sector. So we're really interested in the topic of how do you, in a cost-effective way, make a step change in improving people management skills. So Laura's kindly put the Good Employment Learning Lab link there, and please do go to that, because we will at the end of the project be doing a lot of work to tell people what we found. What did we find about what works for different kinds of managers? Different things are going to work for different people, and we're trying to work out what works for who. On the other side of the project, we're working in adult social care to look at their people management skills, and again to look at what works around enhancing people management skills. We're starting out with peer learning, coaching, and masterclasses on values-based recruitment, which is an important topic at the moment in adult social care. Adult social care is a huge recruitment crisis. It had one before the pandemic, it's got an even bigger one now. It's also got a generational recruitment crisis. So the question of how do we shape good work in adult social care, but also how do we help recruitment, is very important, and it is an area of work that people can go into. One of the sectors that will be a growth sector coming forwards. So that's what I would leave you with. I wanted to come and plug our project and encourage you to get engaged with it. But I would also just sort of throw the question out there to you. One of them around self-employment. How do we make sure that we're creating decent self-employment through the pandemic and not poverty level self-employment? And the second one is, what do we need to do in terms of small business advisor skills and the kinds of interventions we're giving into small firms to give them support with people management?
That was great. Thank you, Julia. Right, has anybody got, I'm sure you must, has anybody got some questions for Julia? No? Ian, you must. You've always got a question.
So I've put a few comments in there, Julia. Nice to meet you. I've tracked some of the work that you've been doing over the years. I know you're quite intrinsically linked to SVEDI and the Business Support Professional Network across the UK. I'm interested to hear your views around programs that have run for people within the welfare to work market, and what is your findings as a academic and professional around what looks good and what looks bad with regards to previous programs, and potential examples of what looks good and what looks bad?
Well, my answer, Ian, is that I did some research on youth enterprise schemes some years ago, and I can talk about those because I don't think the issues have changed massively. But my first answer to that is I think there's been very, very little research on the welfare to work programs, and in fact some people have said they're quite hard to get past the door of to do research. So I suppose the call out is, as a community, what research should we be doing? What could we do that would find out what works? You know, experimenting with things people bringing forwards, and also looking at, sometimes it's only as good as what you're commissioned to give, isn't it? And I think that's my main problem. My main problem is that I think the commissions are often probably not good enough to meet the problem. So if we think of enterprise as the combination of resources to develop goods and services for sale, yeah, people need to go on a journey of accruing the right resources to combine to have a competitive offering. Now, those resources can include skills and knowledge, social networks, money, and then goods like a car or equipment and what have you. And then they're combined in various ways to make an offer for sale. And people need to go through a learning journey as to what the market will bear, don't they? So they come up with an initial offer. And one of the things that's often missing is that resourcing gap to learn that isn't what the market will bear, and that you need to recombine your resources and offer something different. And what I saw in what I call cheap programs that perhaps take people through a kind of fairly fantastical process of, you know, what resources have you got at hand? What could you do? And then sort of support them to write some sort of business canvas or a business plan. Is that there isn't any support for that second round of learning, because we can all say that we want to sell this, that, or the other. The $1 million question is, can you sell it? And that's the bit that's often missing. You know, the sales skills, but also working out how you find that market. And it can be very much about you. I mean, the example of somebody decides to do wedding catering, but only knows people who are poor. So they sell an incredibly low value product to people who've got very little money to spend on wedding catering. Now, it might be sort of valuable to the community, but they're not going to make a living at it. And they need skills and confidence to broker into other kinds of networks and build their confidence and their skills. Can you see this is a pathway of resource accrual that might go beyond a simple business startup program, because then you start thinking about catering colleges. You start thinking about mentoring to bridge out into other kinds of customers. You start to think about support to have a pitch at a wedding fair. You start thinking about maybe getting a job in wedding catering before you go off and decide you want to be a wedding caterer. Can you see how there's a range of organisations within, if you think it in a place-based way, there's a range of organisations that could take you on that journey of accruing those resources. But you just come to me and I put you on a fairly cheap programme of writing a business plan or what the more modern view of a business plan is. You're not necessarily getting those resources, but what I do get as a support provider is a good feeling that you've walked away feeling great about yourselves because you've got this new narrative of your future. What about when that doesn't happen because you can't actually make any sales?
Well, because the other challenge with that is it's not just that they're cheap, they've often got very short time scales on the amount of time you've got to help that person, so they haven't got time for that sort of journey, isn't it? And I know one of the things that we find, fortunately, we also run an ERDF programme, and that actually gives us the ability to help people intensively after they've started up as well. And what we quite often find is people sort of know an initial little group of customers that they're going to work with and they think it's going to be easy, and then they get to sort of about 3 months down the line and they suddenly realise they don't know how to find any more customers. Perhaps, like you said, the first group of customers wasn't the right ones, and they just don't know what to do. And of course, nobody goes into business because they've got great management and sales skills. Generally, they go into business because they've got a thing they think they're good at doing, and it's not HR, it's not finance, it's not any of those sort of skills that you absolutely need to do it for yourself, is it?
No, and I think, you know, we have to ask ourselves sort of on a more macroeconomic level as well, are we enabling this generation of businesses to replace the last ones that we just started? Because a lot of them are in the same sectors,
yeah,
aren't they? So your web designer is your last web designer that you helped last week.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about sort of local economic development, you've got to be quite conscious of those kind of displacement effects that you're having in your business startup provision as well.
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues with regards to programs. So the cheap program or the short program, I can't remember.
Well, it's a combination of the two, I think, isn't it, Ian?
I think it is, and I can agree with you wholeheartedly on the length of the program, which dictates two things for me. For those that are within enterprise because they believe in it, they want to do it the right way, and they want to deliver the right service for the individual, the timeframes are becoming shorter and the interventions are becoming shorter, and the individual to deliver it fast and to the right people and to make the right decisions is becoming more finite. There were a time probably 15 years ago when the pool of business support professionals was somewhat wider, and they were also more specific for the different kind of clients that they worked with. So you'd have that, you know, community enterprise champion coach, you'd have your business advisor, your fast track business advisor for an entrepreneur, because you know as well as I do, very rarely on a government programme do you find an entrepreneur to work with. They don't want you, they don't need you, and if they do need you, you don't know it's happened to you, they've took it and they've gone. So in the main, we're talking about people who need an extent of time and a professional person who understands the implications around UC, the myth, what a sustainable business looks like, as you say, you know, replacement of local businesses and what that looks like. And I noticed some of the chat that's coming through. I think there's something from James around accredited advisors. James, do you want to just make a point around what you've put in your comment on the chat? Have I caught you on the hop there, James? Are you still with us? Hello, James? No?
No, we've lost him.
Okay. I've noted that there's a few people saying that they're looking for business support professionals.
I was going to say, and it was one of the things that James was saying, wasn't it, was what makes a good advisor and what skills and experience should people be looking for, and that's maybe something that people might want to have some discussion about. Oh, he's just on a call.
He is just on a call, yeah.
Difficult, isn't it?
Oh,
I think there's a general grasp of what self-employment or micro-enterprise basically involves in terms of, you know, some of the technical, practical skills involved, isn't there? But in terms of developing sector-based knowledge, then sometimes sort of peer mentoring might be a better idea than trying to have a business advisor who knows everything about everything. And in terms of, you know, I completely agree with Ian that this business advisor also needs to understand universal credit. They need, I think we need to think about our enterprise ecosystems in much broader ways. They may well need to understand mental health services, at least on a referral level. I think that they will need to understand debt advice. You know, they may not be able to provide all these services, but they will need to be able to, and this is my whole argument, in terms of people accruing resources, but also dealing with the problems that they're often situated in and that stand as a barrier to their business. They will often need to be great referrers to other services, and hopefully better than that, all these services will sit round a table and think about what are the pathways that we would create by, if we know one another, we can help to create pathways through further education, a little bit of employment support, a little bit of debt advice, some welfare advice. And it's through, I think, that brokering between those sets of advice that we're going to offer people really the much more joined up and comprehensive support that not everybody needs. I mean, your person who comes out of good quality work with a redundancy package and a great idea will have their own networks, and they may need some basic business advice and support, and, you know, how do you register and what are your regulatory obligations and what have you. But beyond that, hopefully what they need to be done is encouraged to go back to the networks they already have inside their sector to work out how to build that business. Yeah, and to associate with the chambers and what other networks, you know, are out there for people who've got the confidence to walk through the door and do that stuff.
So an example of my experience over the last few months with regards to Restart and people bidding to deliver a programme that helps people back into work is that there are different kinds of provider who see self-employment in completely different ways. You see the provider that comes forward and says, we'd like business advice for those that need that intensive support, and anybody that shows an indication of wanting to go straight into self-employment, whether that's within the gig economy or through something that they put forward that shows that they have a quick ability to do it, is being supported by an employment advisor. And then what you do normally find is those are the clients that fail within the 6 or 12 month window when they either need to survive for an outcome or need to get to a point of the minimum income floor. So what's your kind of views, or what have you found around that, Julia?
As I say, I think it's not really been researched. And unless people know of stuff that I don't know about, I think that considering the scale of funding that goes into this kind of work, there's actually an almost absence of policy, you know, of actual evaluation of that kind of work. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I think that some people have got, if you like, more naturally the skills that you would need and the decent market in which to do it. But your average employment advisor isn't likely to have a good understanding of the array of things needed. Also, just to bounce your idea around, because you start off with some sort of initial idea, don't you? And you've got to keep bouncing that around, you know, idea around and around and around until you find a market for it. And I wouldn't have thought that's within the skill set of an employment advisor, right?
No, I agree. James, you're back again from your emergency call. What we asked was, we noted you put a few posts in and you're hunting for business advice, business support professionals. Do you want to give us your experiences on that?
Yeah, certainly. The sort of the challenges in this sector, certainly linking into kind of things like Restart and work program, often is sort of the funds. So a lot of the finding business coaches, we tend to look for kind of ex-NEA people that have worked on the NEA program, for example. The salaries are quite challenging, because quite often a lot of people are looking kind of around sort of the 40-ish mark. So we've been led down on different avenues. So we've often, if we can't find SVEDI people or people that have sort of ex-NEA advisors, then we've had a lot of success with people that have perhaps have been self-employed, set up their own businesses before and gone through the whole process. And those guys are actually very good. But the challenge is actually finding out if they actually genuinely have good business acumen, because just having set up and lived and breathed and set up your own business actually isn't enough. For example, I set my business 7 years ago, didn't set up a business plan or do a cash flow forecast, embarrassingly. I did 2 years later when I actually got a good business coach on board. But so yeah, it's really kind of like, you know, if we are finding people, there is good people out there that are keen, but yeah, but that's been a good route that we've found. But it's interesting what you said on the employment programs. We've found this similar as well. There's a few providers on work program that did a really good job on self-employment support. I know Shore Trust, for example, had like really good teams set up, and had a team especially within work program for that. But I know not all providers did that. So yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, that's my challenge in this sector. Sometimes the salaries aren't as high as what a lot of the business coaches would have been on some of the, you know, other mainstream DWP contracts.
I think that's interesting. It ties in with something Ian was saying, James, because to be honest, I wouldn't think of paying a business advisor less than sort of 35 to 40 a year full-time equivalent, because I think that's the minimum of what that job is worth. I don't know how anybody else finds that position.
I think there's a number of factors in that for me, Susan and James. Is it depends what they're delivering, and I see that there is a career in business support professional. I think you can start as a level of an enterprise coach or an enterprise champion, even moving on to an enterprise coach and a business advisor. Bringing somebody in from industry, I agree, it's particularly hard. And I think, James, you're recruiting in London, especially if you're mentioning Shore, because that's where most of their NEA was, down that neck of the woods. I agree. I used to have a team of 50 down there in that neck of the woods. And the levels of skills around the salary to something probably up in Manchester and Birmingham, where I was also running, was the difference was about 5 or 6 grand because of the weighting, etc. But you're right. However, what makes it really hard in a program like a welfare to work program is that when the commissioner puts together the funding package, they will have already taken into account what they believe to be the payment of the individuals delivering the service. And quite often they don't realise that a employment advisor probably is around average 26,000, where a business advisor is around 36,000. But the outcomes can be strong, if not stronger, on self-employment if the time frame is there, as Julia mentioned. You know, it's not a fast track process, especially for those that are long-term unemployed. There's many different facets and barriers that get in the way. So it's not an easy ask. And I noticed a remark from Lorraine as well. Lorraine, did you want to make a comment? Are you on mute, Lorraine?
Yeah. Yeah, just the comment that in experience someone was asking about some you know, historical data and things, and I found that quite often, even if the business fails, they succeed in something else. It could be going into gig economy, for instance, leads to some other inspiration, and just from gaining that, it's not always a failure. That's what I was just.
No, absolutely not. And I always say to people that even if it doesn't work or they change their minds and they just don't like it, it's made them more employable. And I think an employer would always look more favourably on somebody who'd gone out and tried something than somebody who hadn't tried at all. And they will have learned, they will have learned skills, and they will have gained things that will make them a better employee.
Although I think that if we have programs where we lose touch with people, then they go through the failure experience alone, then I think there's a number of different outcomes that can happen. I think, to be honest with you, we make ourselves feel better through this narrative of it's a learning journey and it'll lead to other things. I'm not sure that we've got a lot of evidence to support it, but I'm sure it happens some of the time. But I do think we need to open our minds up to the other routes that could happen. And the other routes that can happen can include a complete mental health breakdown and debt problems from chasing a business that you're completely invested in. You've gone around telling everybody, hi, I'm a business owner. You've got into debt, and now you're facing, sort of the humiliation. And unless you're what I found in some longitudinal qualitative work I did was, if you've got a tendency to blame yourself for things, and you're in a context where nobody else is, you're individualized from other people who started up, so you can't see that this is a very common outcome. Yeah, so you've come down from this great big high of who you were going to be in this business plan down to, possibly lower than where you started, depending on whether or not you got yourself into debt, then you can end up in quite a thing to get your head round, and a bit of a problem to dig yourself out of. So that's why I think that we need to be commissioned in order to avoid that. And this is what I mean about decent self-employment. I'm sure that there is tremendous ability to learn through these experiences, but I think we should structure them more explicitly as learning experiences that we support, and that we should tell people in what way we believe that their learning experiences and how they could learn through that experience of business closure, rather than just kind of standing back and hoping that's what happens.
Yeah, and you're right, exactly right. It needs that support where someone is there to be a sounding board, networking, that sort of thing, just so you can guide someone through those rough patches and make sure they don't come out the other end with a mental health issue or whatever.
It's something that nobody wants to pay for, is it? Because that's the outcome anybody wants to buy.
About it, why would you want to pay for something that creates negative outcomes as well? So it seems expensive, but actually the hidden expense of it being bad is bad. And I think we've probably all been around people who are getting into uncontrollable credit card debt. And it is really worrying, because that's what people are tending to get into, personal debt. It's not business debt, it's personal debt. And so we need people to recognise when a business isn't going to happen, or it's not going to happen for them because they don't have that second round of resources. The business might have happened for somebody else who had it. I've been with businesses that have bought second-hand equipment. The equipment goes goes, you know, up, or they've stocked shops but they half stocked them, or the shops aren't secure. I mean, to be honest with you, some of this is our liability. Why are we starting people in businesses that frankly we kind of know had very poor chances, and really hoping for the best?
Yeah, I just want to, and I completely agree. I mean, probably the most successful programs in my time had 3 years of support post start, and I would say a fair percentage of those that failed took closure support, for want of a better terminology, and that was built in. I haven't seen that built into any program for a long time now. I think the other thing I want to flip around to before I think you probably picked up on Erica, Suzanne,
Yes.
is the gig economy. I think I am not somebody that wants to completely beat the gig economy. I think there is good and bad to the gig economy. I think there's extremely bad for people that don't know what they're letting themselves in for. But there is also some extremely good cases of where the gig economy has supported either people in employment or in self-employment to be able to get to a stage where they want to be, and the flexibility that it brings. So I just wanted to put that view in and see what your response was on that, Julia.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a bit like the question of giving people secure hours, isn't it? You know, students want very reduced hours, for example, and there are stages in your life where you can bear the risks associated with some gig economy work, aren't there? And the stages in your life where that's not going to take you anywhere good. So I think one of the things I'm interested in coming out of COVID is some of these forms of work can be good bridges. You know, we could have programs that specifically treat them like bridges. They're bridges between one thing and another, and you're explicitly building your resources. You know, your confidence, your work readiness, your knowledge and skills, you know, whatever it is, you know, we could sit down and say, you are building these things through this activity. And then you need to think about the transition out. And self-employment's just the same.
Yeah.
You know, for me, lots of people will use self-employment as possibly quite a safe haven, as a transition point. It could keep your morale up, it could keep your contacts up, etc. It's just, and what I mean, a good example of this is that one of the big areas of growth in self-employment has been mothers. There's one of the biggest factors of growth in self-employment. Now that's largely because there was a lack of part-time flexible work out there, so people were turning to self-employment. They were often quite skilled people. What worries me if they stay in businesses that are very unprofitable is that what does that do to sort of the gender pay gap, wealth pay gap in the long term? Yeah. So, but nothing wrong with it as a bridge to keep your skills, keep your network, keep your arm in, right? But how do you transition out of it? Yeah. So, how do we encourage the provision of business and enterprise support where people have someone to keep making sense of these things with? You know, to think about their skills and their networks and what are you doing and moving forwards from one of these forms of work to another.
Suzanne,
Erica, you put your hand down, but you have something to say.
Yeah, I did. I mean, not really any questions, I guess, more observations. So I also put in the chat that we're looking for a business advisor. I've called it a business and enterprise officer. I work for Sovereign Housing Association, so I haven't introduced myself. So I head up the employment and training team there, and I've worked, you know, in employment skills for a long time. And I think what we've noticed is over the years, all the employment and training officers I've had, you know, they've had an interest in business, but I think the reason we've generated that role is because actually it's quite time consuming to give the right support to people who want to look at enterprise and business startup. And there is kind of a specialist knowledge and approach. You know, even I do think a lot of the skills are transferable. You know, they're covering a lot of what an ETO would, but you know, having that time to nurture and that expertise around kind of cash flow and business planning, definitely is a skill set. I also think the other important thing is about, you know, on your point there, Julia, is actually we need them to be able to say, no, this isn't a good idea, you know, and having that tough conversation, say, to manage expectations. And so I actually think there should be a really long journey up to the point of actually somebody getting into business. I think a lot of it is around, contract outcomes are about business startup, but actually that's not always a good solution now. It might be later or as part of a job, or like you say, as a kind of a bridging situation, but actually we need to be confident to say it's not the right move for you, or we're not sure it's the right move for you. And the other one I was going to say is, a lot of the contracts around are, again, about starting a business, but actually a lot of the support that my teams have always given is about keeping somebody in business, diversifying their business, but there's never any contract outcomes associated to that. It's all about new business. All the grants are new business, all the loans are new business. And in the recovery from COVID, a lot of it is actually going to be about preventing disaster, preventing debt and crisis and mental health breakdown. So I think in terms of a lobbying piece, there needs to be a conversation about that. How can we diversify funding and contracts to recognise that we need to help people stay afloat, as well as always pushing people into new business? So yeah, I don't really know. I'm not expecting a response. It's a couple of observations from our side, and we're hoping that post, and I've taken some notes because some of those points are really interesting. I've gone to kind of enterprise providers to find out what that good person looks like, but we're hoping that will enable us to provide kind of dedicated support to the people that are interested. And because enterprise is also self-employment, people who are hairdressers, labourers, but don't have to do tax returns. For me, that's also business startup and making legitimate income off of something they can already do. Because in the past, I've done child minding programs, for example. So they've done the CPOP qualification, and they're great with children, and their home can be offsetted. But actually, to become a childminder, what you need to do is run your own business, and that is where everybody falls down. So it's how can we invest support there? So I'm rambling on now, but just a few kind of points and observations that I think we need to think about as a sector.
Yeah, but all good ones, Erica.
Erica, can I come back with 2 or 3 thoughts on that? I mean, first of all, I think those are some markets where you are more likely to succeed.
Yeah.
You are more. People may say, for example, your hairdresser, they may need help to find people who can pay for a decent amount of money for a haircut, rather than perhaps the people they already automatically know. So there's a piece of work there, I think. But that kind of mobile hairdressing thing can work. Yeah. I think so. I think sometimes we do need to think about. Certainly construction is, the sector where people can achieve social mobility because they just work and work and work, don't they?
Yeah.
And if they can find enough work, then they can often make a living at it if they're skilled at it.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're starting people in business who don't have those basic skills, and we're starting them in construction businesses. Well, then we need to go back and think about FE and apprenticeships. They need to take a step backwards in order to then come forward and say, you might want to be self-employed, but first of all, you've got to learn to be a brickie.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the journey you need to go on for us to think in a much more sort of long-term way with that person. So that would be one observation. The second one is government did a lot of analysis 20 years around its business startup programs, and came to the conclusion that government couldn't easily decide which businesses would work, and therefore you sort of leave it to the market. But in terms of startup support for people from deprived backgrounds, I think we can very easily tell the businesses that have absolutely no chance.
Yeah, exactly.
I really do think we can, because there's nowhere near enough resource to pay for what they need to do, or because they've got nowhere near the skill or networks to do it. And unless we can provide the support to get them to the point where they accrue those resources, the honest and open thing is absolutely to tell them, and have the confidence to tell them, I think, as you've said.
Yeah.
I just make a point on that one, Julia. Of all the business advisors or enterprise coaches or enterprise champions that ever worked with or for me, the most successful ones are the ones that have the ability to get the individual to make that choice themselves.
Yeah.
And the only way they were able to do that, and why they were so successful, they knew all the strings and reasons why that person wouldn't go self-employed. And it wasn't just because they hadn't got £2,000 to buy a motor scooter, or they hadn't got 20 customers lined up for the first month. It was personal reasons, it was family reasons, it was when do you have to hit that minimum income floor, when does your benefits peel away, etc., etc. So my advice to anybody recruiting, and I also know I saw another post from you, James, who recruits to the NEA. The NEA is probably at this point the biggest crop of business advisors that work with this client group. However, on average, they probably only have half a dozen interventions with an individual
Yeah.
before they'll actually go self-employed. So the business advisors for an NEA have to do it very quickly. They have to work it out extremely quickly, and they sometimes do have to get to that point where they tell the individual.
Oh, I tell you what, on NEA, we make the work coaches tell a lot of them before they even get as far as a referral. Otherwise, you have to, or you'd be swamped with, completely unsuitable people.
Yeah.
And then do another sift once we get them. But no, and I know the other providers have to do it as well. But it's trying to sort of sift people out before they even get as far as you.
Yeah.
Exactly the same sort of you're talking about, Julia. It's people wanting to do something that they need a set of skills and quals for, like bricklaying, that they haven't got. And we said you have to go away and get those, and then come back when you've got them. You just can't give them the time to do that.
And I think for some people that's an incentive to engage, and that could be an incentive to engage in a way that nothing else would incentivize them, because they don't want what they see as the pretty rubbish job that exists at the end of this training course, but they might quite like the idea of having a little business around that skill. So it can be quite an incentive to get people back into training, I think. And one thing that Ian said that I find quite encouraging really is that when the really sort of big work that I did on this was some years ago, and when I looked at what business advisors did and the skills they had, and then I also sat on the panels where they decided which businesses to support with a grant or what have you, there was a great assumption around, well, presumably they can get benefits. Presumably they'll get some help with their childcare. Let's not make those assumptions. Let's go and find out. Let's be absolutely sure. And as you say, reflect with that person on the realities of childcare and welfare benefits. And and housing, as I know under universal credit it's all rolled in together, but people don't want to put their housing at risk. So I think that having those skills is absolutely fundamental to being a business advisor on these programs. But you tell me, does your average business advisor on these programs have that understanding?
No. So this is where I wanted to. We were going to peel on quite interestingly to the standard setting organisation, which is SFEDI. I know Julia and Suzanne and myself have worked with or alongside SFEDI for many years, and the different levels of business support professionals changed through that time, and requirements for what a person needs to have as an accreditation or a qualification would seem to be quite often generic in some people's views. I think it's down to having a generic set of standards, and I know what you've said, James, again, but underneath the generic standards, it is that additionality that's required for the client group that you work with. Advisor is a business advisor. You could call yourself a business advisor because you know how to put cash flow together, a business plan, survival budget, and a marketing plan. Great, wonderful. But what are those other intangible things around that individual? Because let's be honest, the business is the individual at that front end, and this is the effect mechanism. So I'm quite keen to see how that accreditation and qualification market is moving as we move forward. I don't know about your views on that, Julia.
Yeah, so I'm not very close actually, but I think to what the accreditation criteria are, but I think it's a very pertinent point, because I would say that to work on any of these programs, that having an understanding and a relationship with the people who have a better understanding of the complexities of, particularly around welfare support and childcare support, are absolutely pivotal to being a successful business advisor, to help somebody think through whether this is right for them or how they can make it work for them. I wonder as well, thinking about the skills of business advisors, whether we get too hung up on the technical bits around, understanding a business plan or a cash flow or whatever, which, you know, I'm not saying that they're not important as thinking tools, but they're fantasies. All of that stuff is a fantasy until you get out there and try and sell it, and then you're back into, you know, if we think about entrepreneurship theory, has moved way on from the idea that you start with the business idea, you develop a business plan, you trade. There's this massive process in the middle whereby, you know, you try to gather in resources, hopefully those that don't belong to you. You combine those in various ways and you experiment with what the market can bear. And, you know, that's got potential for a massive bit of learning in there that, as you say, is a set of transferable skills, because you become an enterprising person. Even if you find out the market won't bear, you've nevertheless had a lot of experiments and done a lot of good stuff in there. How much are we developing business advisors who understand, have been through? I don't think personal experience of being through means you can necessarily teach somebody else, but it might be helpful. But people have got, you know, a little bit, you know, an understanding of that part of, and actually some of the innovations in enterprise education could be brought in here, because this is how enterprise education is done now in universities. It's not done in a business planning kind of way at all.
No. There's traits and there's competencies, isn't there? I mean, a trait sits heavily within an entrepreneur, but what are the competencies and the gaps that are missing? If somebody has those traits, you very, very much want them to succeed and go self-employed, but those competencies quite often are not delivered. And I agree with the business plan, but when you have a program that's purely based around a business plan, which has always been a bit of an irk of mine. Now, don't get me wrong, I think a business plan, I more use a business plan to get somebody to empty their mind, just get it out for a while. Let's have a look at it in a different context instead of bouncing between your ears. It doesn't have to look like a formal document. It doesn't have to look like, you know, every section is completed by the book. But I find that an interesting comment as well, Julia.
I think these things could be taught to business advisors. I don't think we need to rely on some sort of very informal tacit skills. I think we could teach these to business advisors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a comment there from James. James, if I go back many years when I was working in, well, even in New Deal days, on the New Deal self-employment option, we found that the old-fashioned business advisor back from the early enterprise agency days, who quite often were seconded in from banks or local authorities, didn't have that empathy. So we built a program based around units from an information advice and guidance standard, from coaching standards, and from the SVEDI business support standard, to develop an enterprise coaching model. And that was kind of the bedrock for the success of those. I think somebody mentioned a few welfare to work organisations were very successful in self-employment and sustainment as well, Julia, not just into self-employment, but sustainment. And it was built around that enterprise coaching model, James.
I was just thinking, James, actually, seeing what you were saying about coaching and mentoring, one of the best business advisors I think I ever employed, he rang me one day, his NEA client hadn't turned up, and he said, oh, you know, what do you do? Because it was one of the first ones he'd done. I said, oh, if he doesn't turn up again, you know, if it's his second time, bin him off. He goes, no, I'm not having that. And he rang back half an hour later and he said, I've rang him and I've told him, how does he think he's going to run a business if he can't get his ass out of bed in the mornings? And he said to me, oh, I've never thought of that. You're right. He says, and he's turned out, and he then turned into Mr. Diligent and set up a really good business. And it had just never connected in his brain that was something that was going to impact on his ability to run a business. So there is those things about, you know, coaching, mentoring, empathy, and knowing when it's appropriate to say what to people, because some people wouldn't have responded very well to that, but other people, it's just exactly what they need to hear, isn't it?
I had an example in a research project of a young man who was very hardworking and diligent, really wanted to succeed. It was at exactly the right stage in life. He had a young family and all that kind of. But he resolved every argument with a fight. That's how we brought up, you know.
Yeah.
So how could he grow, right?
Yeah.
So he got this fantastic volunteer business advisor who just did a social skills piece on him.
Yeah.
But also he was a gardener, got him a contract with his local housing association that became his bedrock contract. And so I think this thing of helping people to bridge into markets that their set of networks would never normally allow is also the skill of a business advisor. But he helped him get this contract. You know, how do you put together the thing to get the contract with a housing association? The housing association came somewhat towards him in so doing, and they gave him a trial piece of work. And then this guy got a job in Bulgaria, and within about a month, this young man had a fight with his member of staff. Now, that's not to say that don't think that could have worked, but it goes to show that it needed longer.
Yeah.
It needed longer because, you know, it was heartbreaking, really, because something beautiful was happening in front of us and then fell apart, you know, with quite catastrophic consequences for that family.
Yeah.
So, you know, some of your clients need a lot of support, don't they? And they need a lot of multifaceted support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Erica, you're typing. Do you want to not type and speak?
Yeah, and just say.
Literally only going to say I've got to drop off now.
Right.
That's so shame me into public. But
I think we're coming towards a natural close anyway, Erica.
So it's been a really interesting discussion, and be great to connect to some more people via LinkedIn or like follow up afterwards. You know, we are looking at how we can provide a better business offer to our residents and to our communities. Luckily we're not bound by external funding in order to do that. So, you know, that example you said about kind of somebody wants to go into construction but needs to learn how to lay bricks, we are in a position where we can follow that journey, you know, to allow people to have the best opportunity. Yeah. So really thank you for the session, and would love to follow up afterwards. But thanks for highlighting that I had to leave early.
Sorry.
So I'm really joking. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Erica.
As Ian said, I think we are sort of winding to a bit of a natural conclusion for today. Anyway, so has anybody else got any questions or comments for Julia before we do this? No?
I think just one for me, Suzanne, and you were probably going to mention it yourself. We really value having everybody on this meeting. We really value that self-employment, enterprise support and enterprise skills and social enterprise, which is part of our agenda remit.
It is.
And I know Suzanne works with an organisation of the same kind of ilk, but I worked with a social enterprise for 17 years. Yeah. We do want to expand the remit of these programmes and these discussion points. We value any questions that you want to put forward to us, any topic areas that you'd like us to challenge and us hunt out the best placed people in the market to come and talk. And we really do value the kind of discussion and opportunity that we've had from Julia with that academic drive, or even a wider drive that she's obviously looking to see if we can find a way of getting a lot more data around this customer group. So please, can you please get any information or questions or topics or subject areas or interesting speakers over to us? We'd really value that.
Absolutely.
And I've just put my email there, just because, you know, we are interested in research and evaluation work around this, you know, whether or not that's using your network as partners for us to bid to external funds, or whether you're commissioning evaluation research yourself, because I think it's really good. It's genuinely important to get a better evidence base, and to also create ways of sharing that evidence base in creative ways so that we can learn and maybe create some evidence to create better commissions in the first place.
Absolutely.
That's great. Right, and Laura's just beat me to another one, which is to remind everybody that the next date is the 13th of May, if you'd like to pop a save the date in your calendars, and we'll be coming out with the topics on that soon. And I think just to run ahead of that, I think the next one after that is the 8th of July, 8th of September and the 11th of November, which takes us up to the end of the year, which is a bit scary. I'm just looking quickly. I think Amanda's typing something. So I just want to see what that is before we go. But, well, in the meantime, I'll say thank you very much from us all to Julia, and it would be good to have you back some other time. I'm sure there's lots more for us to talk about. It's been really, really interesting and really useful.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you again, and see you again in May.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.